If you've watched any of the videos on this channel, you'll know that I love going to the movies. I love watching movies. I love getting lost in someone else's reality for a little while. It's a way of escapism for me. And when I was 18, I used to love going to movie marathons. They were a really big thing at the time. And somehow we used to go to them. They'd finish at 5 a.m. and then we'd rock up at our weekend job at 8 a.m. the next day and do 10-hour shifts all weekend, and then we'd be straight back at uni 8 to 5 Monday to Friday, and then going out during the week. I don't know how we had the stamina for that. Like, just thinking about that makes me tired now, which is very sad. But I thought what I would do this weekend is I thought I would do a movie marathon and take you along for the ride with me. Some of the movies are movies I haven't seen before and have always intended on seeing. In fact, most of them are. And one is a movie I've watched before but really want to watch again because I think there's more to take than I took the first time. And I think initially I was quite confused the first time I saw it. And I just thought, you know, like, I worked pretty hard this week. I've worked pretty hard for the last many weeks. So why not do a movie marathon? And also just, you know, why not? So the movies I'm going to watch are Bill and Ted's. Never seen it. Patients in Pilates have been talking a lot about it because they were talking about the filming of Bill and Ted's 3, and apparently I have to see it. So Bill and Ted's. I'm going to rewatch Mr. Nobody. I'm going to watch Kramer versus Kramer, Tootsie, and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. So I'm almost 40 minutes into Tootsie and I can't believe I haven't seen this movie before. Dustin Hoffman is amazing, and he just walloped the guy from, I think it's from Naked Gun, on the head when he was supposed to kiss him. And I mean, it's kind of weird watching this in a like post Me Too, mid Me Too era, because I could totally see that this is how Hollywood is run. We just dismiss certain things that women say and pat them on the bum and tell them how they should play the role. But you know, apart from that, this movie is pretty amazing so far. I can't believe I haven't watched it before. It's hilarious. So far, this movie is very deserving of the hype that it has received and the cult status that it has. Why is he sweating so much? So I've just finished watching Tootsie and I can't believe I've never seen it before. And I can't believe I thought that was Leslie Nielsen from Naked Gun in it. But anyway, it was quite an interesting movie, and I thought Dustin Hoffman did a great job and generally a pretty stellar cast. When Jessica Lange's father is falling in love with him, I was just howling with laughter at that entire scene, and watching him suddenly realize what women have to put up with, and then he comes home and the guy from his show is singing underneath his window, and it was just hilarious. But as I was watching it, it was interesting to kind of see the themes that they cover in this movie, which is like equality and how women are treated in Hollywood. And I would be really interested to know how much of a storm it kicked up at the time when it was released, and how much of a conversation was had, given how much of a conversation has resulted as a result of the Me Too movement. It was really interesting because it's obviously still really relevant what they were talking about in this movie. But it was overall, it was a great movie, very lighthearted in areas, not always lighthearted, but it was a great movie, great cast, and I really enjoyed it. Now I'm going to move on to Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Just in case you are like me and haven't seen Tootsie, Tootsie is the story of an actor called Michael Dorsey who is basically difficult to work with because he has lots of opinions and has a hard time not expressing them. And his goal is to prove that he can play any role, and in order to get someone to hire him and to prove himself, he goes to an audition dressed as a woman and he lands a role on a show. And when he is dressed as a woman, he's called Dorothy, and he starts to get his eyes opened a little bit about how women are treated. And the reason it's called Tootsie is because women on the show and generally in the entertainment industry were referred to as honey, toots, tootsie, things like that, while the men were called by their names. And the the story is a little bit about how he kind of really shakes things up on the set that he works on and starts changing people's attitudes and starts addressing the disparities and equality and things like that head on and in a very direct manner, and ends up with some of those moments being televised. And of course people obviously find that a character role that they can attach themselves to, that they can relate to, and he becomes quite popular. So that's Tootsie in a nutshell. There's also a love story, but it's just a really interesting movie that tackles some social questions and socially accepted behavior that perhaps should not be, while mixing in some lighthearted comedy that is quite funny. I've just finished watching Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and it was a beautiful movie. Spoilers if you haven't seen it. The movie opens with Clementine and Joel meeting on the train, and she is very quirky and extremely forward, and there's just something about them. They vibe straight away, and you see the very first beginnings of their relationship, and then very quickly it begins the demise of the relationship, and you have Joel grieving the end of the relationship and talking to his friends about how he went to see Clementine and she looked at him as though she didn't recognize him, and he learns that she's had his memories of him erased from her mind. You then go with Joel through the process of having Clementine erased from his mind, and it explains things from the opening scenes, like the strange dent on his car with the yellow paint and how that got there, and you go through his memories of her from the end of their relationship, slowly moving forward to the beginning of their relationship. And once they get to happier times, he changes his mind about the process of erasing her, and he's endeavoring to find a place in his mind where he can hide her so he doesn't lose the memory of her. I love the concept of this film, that you could go back and erase the memories of something. I have always loved when in movies you have someone who's usually grieving over a lost relationship, and they meet, their fairy godparent, and they ask to have all memories of that person removed from their memory, and you get to see what your life would have been like without that person in it. I love the concept of the butterfly effect, and that teeny tiny little moments in your life can completely change the trajectory of your life, and that really small decisions you make have such a massive impact on where you end up going. And I think it's such an interesting concept because, so many times in life you want something really badly, and for whatever reason it doesn't work out, and at the time you're really gutted and you can't understand why that didn't work. And then it's not till time passes much later that you realize, oh, well, had I have got that, I wouldn't be in the position I am now, and I'm much happier in the position I am in now. So I think it's a really interesting concept, and I love that they also look at the ethics of erasing someone from their mind, and also that it is not all that ethical, and the people who are doing it, one of them, Patrick, played by Elijah Wood, actually falls in love with Clementine while he's erasing her memories, and then he uses her memories with Joel to try and establish a relationship with Clementine, but it seems to give her more the creeps, almost like she still has the whispers of a memory of Joel in her. And then when Joel wakes up, he inexplicably gets on a train to Montauk, and you're back at the beginning of the movie, and it's actually like a big loop, and you realize that what you thought was their initial meeting was actually them finding each other again, even though they'd been erased from each other's lives. So it's a really beautiful story, and then you get a little bit of them discovering the truth about what's happened to them, and it's just such a beautiful story. And I loved the cinematography and the way they used that for making just a really subtle but powerful point about grief and depression and things like that. Like there's this one scene early on in the movie where Joel goes to see Clementine, and he goes to see her at her place of work in a bookstore, and she looks at him like she doesn't remember him, and he doesn't understand, and he's understandably confused and hurt, and he leaves. And as he leaves, all the lights in the building progressively shut down, and I just think that's such a beautiful way to make the emotion of that moment more intense. So far then I've had Tootsie and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and neither of those movies I'd ever seen before. And so far I'm really happy with the choices of this movie marathon. They're great movies. I'm really happy that I watched them. I loved Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. I love that idea of choice and of love and loss and grief, and the idea of the butterfly effect and what happened if that person was never really part of your life. And the idea of erasing memories. I think that's it's a cool story. So now I think I might do Bill and Ted's first movie. I don't really have any particular urge to watch this movie, but I thought I might do one lighthearted, one not so much, one lighthearted, one not so much. I'm really only watching this movie because, well, I love Keanu Reeves, and it's been a topic of conversation in one of my Pilates classes because one of the participants is very, very excited about Bill and Ted's number 3. I am less excited about all these reboots and remakes and series that are getting extra seasons and things, sometimes where a story has been finished and closed. But then I don't really know anything about Bill and Ted's other than that they're... it's kind of a Wayne's World vibe. But I love Wayne's World, or I did as a kid. I wonder actually who came first, Bill and Ted's or Wayne's World, but... well, we'll find out. So Bill just said, "You killed Ted, you medieval dickweed." Now I know where so many weird things that we used to say as kids came from. So, Bill and Ted's. Okay, so it comes before Wayne's World and clearly influenced Wayne's World a lot. Okay, but it's just... felt like I was just watching two young idiots dick around for an hour and a half, and I guess I kind of was. I always thought the premise of Bill and Ted's was that they were, the wild stallions were supposed to create the song that saved the universe, but maybe that's more in number 2 and then obviously number 3 because they haven't created the song yet. But yeah, I didn't love it. It's weird also watching Keanu be so squeaky when you know what he sounds like now, and also he didn't sound that squeaky in River's Edge, and that came out before Bill and Ted's, but didn't like Bill and Ted's. I don't know, maybe I would have liked it better if I watched it when I was younger, but I was like nearly 5 when this came out, so probably wouldn't have actually liked it when it came out because it wasn't about princesses and unicorns and stuff like that. But I have Kramer versus Kramer and Mr. Nobody still to go for this movie marathon. I haven't seen Kramer versus Kramer. I have seen Mr. Nobody. And Mr. Nobody, I definitely feel like I need to watch again because it kind of exploded my brain a bit the first time I watched it. And I remember thinking, kind of at certain points in the movie, like, what's the point in this, because no matter what he chooses, he dies young. But then the further I got through it, the more my perspective on it changed, and you see that actually at the end the boy doesn't make a choice. But I've read so many different interpretations of this movie that I want to watch it again because they're all really, really different. The only trouble was to actually watch this movie, I had to buy the DVD online, and it's a UK region code. My DVD player is my grandma's old one, so it is region specific, so I can't watch it on TV, I have to watch it on my computer. So I might watch Kramer versus Kramer now, and then I'll watch Mr. Nobody in bed from my laptop. But yeah, let's see how we go. But I guess it's got to be up from here, right? I would think that Kramer versus Kramer and Mr. Nobody are going to be better than Bill and Ted's. So.
At 8 o'clock, I'm walking home with the vice president who tells me I'm going to be the next creative director of this department. I come through this door. store to share with my wife with what Monday's going to be one of the 5 best days of my life, and she looks at me, cools her cucumber, and tells me she doesn't want to live with me anymore.
Douche. Do you think Dustin Hoffman's being a douche in this movie? You do? Yeah, me too. Good Lord, I hope they do the redemption arc well in this movie, because right now, Dustin Hoffman's character is the biggest douche ever. It's like, I'm surprised Meryl Streep didn't leave you earlier, man. Like, you just ditched your kid with some woman at the school and ran off. What do you think, Bobby? Hey? Is he a giant douche? Yes? Giant douche?
Mommy has gone away. Sometimes in the world, daddies go away, and mommies bring up their little boys. But sometimes a mommy can go away too, and you have your daddy to bring you up. I have gone away because I must find something interesting to do for myself in the world. Everybody has to, and so do I.
Who says that to a kid?
Being your mommy was one thing, but there are other things too, and this is what I have to do. I did not get a chance to tell you this, and that is why I'm writing you now.
Poor kid, what
Always
parents?
be your mommy.
I've just finished Kramer versus Kramer, and that was depressing. So, spoiler warning, although really at this point, whatever. But in the very beginning of the movie, the first 20 minutes, half an hour, I hated Ted Kramer. I wasn't a particular fan of Joanna either, because she just walked out and left her kid. But he was such a giant douche that you could totally understand that someone just cracks and needs to get away from him. The guy didn't even know what grade his kid was in. He just dropped him at school and dumped and ran basically to work. And you could kind of see that they were going to go for a redemption arc early on. And I was just thinking it better be a bloody good one, because it's going to be really hard to come back from this. And as the movie went on, he started to learn to be a parent. But it wasn't really enough. And you could kind of see that they were trying to make a point that neither party was guilt-free. But I felt very little sympathy for his character, because, you know, a lot was made of how he was giving up work and being late for work and, you know, getting punished because he was less involved at work because he was having to show up from time to time for his kid. And I just felt like really little sympathy for that, because in my experience, once a family have children, in most families, when the kid is sick, it's the woman who has to call in sick. It's the woman who puts her career on hold. I mean, I know there are exceptions to that, and there are some families where it's 50-50, but most of the families I know, it's the woman who has to give it up. So in a way, I was kind of like, well, you know, get a taste of your own medicine, and it's about time you showed up for your son, because you didn't know what grade he was in. So as the movie progresses, the little boy predictably thinks that he's the reason his mother left because he was bad. And at least Ted Kramer gave a really good explanation to the child and finally seemed to maybe understand his role in the breakup. And when his son injured himself and he just ran with him to the hospital and was holding him while he was having stitches, that was when it really started to turn around for me. But really the way they played both parties are equally guilty is just by having Meryl Streep's character be absent. And side note, Meryl Streep and her daughter look so alike, it's kind of scary. So when Joanna comes back, Kramer versus Kramer really kicks up a notch, and the acting is just amazing. I'm not surprised that they both won Oscars, particularly Dustin Hoffman. He did an amazing job. And then they go to court, and by the time they go to court, I have gone from being like anti-Ted to being very pro-Ted. But then I wonder if they'd had more of the mother's storyline, whether I would be as pro-Ted or whether I'd be half and half. And I had seen discussions where They talked about how equal this movie was in not laying blame and showing that both parties basically had their flaws and their guilt. And yes, it does do that, but by omission, it really allows Ted to have the redemption story, and it doesn't allow Joanna that as much, even though in the end she realizes she's not the best place for the child to be. But when she showed up to pick up the kid after she won custody, and then she's downstairs going, you know, I realized this is his home and he's already home and he should stay with you. I was like, for fuck's sake, after all of that. This movie does make a really valid point, I think, that when people go through these kind of situations, it's just hideous, and I don't know how the lawyers do it. I couldn't do it all day trying to make someone out to be a hideous parent when you know they have redeeming qualities as a parent, and that it's good for the child to have, in most cases, two parents that love them. But I think so often, like, the role of the father gets downsized, and sometimes people have really fantastic fathers and really fantastic mothers, and the dad just gets like 2 weekends a month. And I mean, I realize you have to take into account stability for the child and all of this sort of stuff. And I just think that they had a really, you know, valid point that being a parent is about loving the child, being willing to sacrifice for the child, being present and being stable, and not so much about your gender. So now, after that super depressing movie, I am now going to go and watch Mr. Nobody, which is the final movie in this movie marathon. As I already said, when I watched this movie the first time, there's multiple Nemos. So Jared Leto plays multiple versions of Nemo Nobody. And I mean, that's such a horrible name, Nemo Nobody. But I mean, that's kind of the point. And basically he is presented with a choice between living with his mother or living with his father after they separated. And maybe this is a weird movie to actually watch after Kramer versus Kramer. But anyway, and so it kind of comes off like in that moment where he has to choose, he sees the outcomes of all these possible choices, kind of like the butterfly effect, essentially, of making the choice to go with his mother, or making the choice to stay with his father, or changing his mind and then racing after his mother's train, or whatever. But it just kind of, it was a complicated movie, and it had an adventure into space, and I don't think I was concentrating enough last time I watched this movie, and it was also like not super straightforward. And I think that the director deliberately left things open to interpretation, because there are a lot of interpretations for this movie, and like some of the ones I've seen are really different to what I initially took away. But what I really liked about this movie was the way it followed each choice, and how different your life could be if you made a different choice. So I'm going to go and watch it again and see if I take something different away this time, or get better clarity on what I experienced last time. And then this movie marathon is over and next week begins. Tomorrow is Monday, and this was not a bad way to spend a Sunday. I did end up finishing my movie marathon last night with Mr. Nobody, but I finished at 2 a.m, so I didn't bother filming what I thought of it. And what I decided to do was take a few notes as I went to try and help me make sense of this complex plot and keep track of all the various Nemos. And I thought I would just take a few notes, but the more notes I took, the more clear everything became. And I mean, these are my notes. So I'm actually going to turn this into a whole nother video about Mr. Nobody itself. It's a really interesting film where essentially the premise is, if you never make a choice, then anything is possible. And a 9-year-old boy is asked to make an impossible choice to choose between his mother and his father. And you basically see the butterfly effect of each choice and how things integrate with each other, and where Nemo ends up depending on all the variations that result from each choice that he makes. And then at the end, he makes a choice. So it's actually a really interesting film. it's very complex. I can see why it didn't do so well in the movies, because it's just that little bit too complex to follow without taking notes in a cinema. Like, it's I would think you would just leave confused, but I think if it was a little bit less complex, then it would have done really, really, really well in the cinemas. But that being said, it's super interesting because it's crazy cockatoos, because it's super interesting because it's not a standard film, and it's really interesting because it's so complex. And it's also really interesting because I think there's many different ways you could interpret this movie, and there's many different ways you could understand the plot. But, oh my god, they are losing their minds. But I think that's a deliberate move that the director has made to make this movie allow the audience to make their own decisions and make their own choices. So definitely recommend that you catch Mr. Nobody if you can. And like I said, I will do another review, a separate review for Mr. Nobody to explain it in more detail. But know that you're probably going to need to watch it at least twice to really take it all in. I really could watch it a third time quite happily and still probably take in more. But it's a 2.5-hour movie. I hope you've enjoyed this movie marathon with me and the movie marathon review. If you have, please hit like below and subscribe to my channel, and maybe we'll do this again sometime.